The town of Millbrook had endured 3 weeks of sub-zero temperatures when the last grocery store ran out of food. Outside, the blizzard that meteorologists said would never come howled like a living thing, burying cars and houses under 20 feet of snow. Inside his basement laboratory, Dr. Marcus Chen watched his neighbors through security cameras, knowing they were starting to starve. For 5 years they had mocked him, called him paranoid, laughed at the massive excavation behind his house, the strange equipment deliveries, the endless construction noise. Even his own brother had stopped speaking to him, convinced Marcus had lost his mind after losing his job at the agricultural research facility. But Marcus knew what the climate models really showed. He'd seen the classified reports, the ones that predicted the polar vortex collapse that would plunge half the continent into an ice age. So he'd built something impossible, a self-sustaining underground ecosystem capable of feeding 500 people indefinitely. Now, as desperate families began breaking into abandoned homes searching for scraps, Marcus faced an impossible question. How do you choose who deserves to live when you hold the only key to salvation? The monitors flickered between camera feeds positioned throughout the town. Camera 12 showed the Hendersons trying to break through their own frozen garage door with a baseball bat. Camera 7 captured old Mrs. Patterson sitting in her dark kitchen, staring at empty cabinets. Camera 3 revealed something that made Marcus's stomach clench. A group of teenagers kicking down the door of the pharmacy, probably looking for anything edible in the small convenience section. His thermal sensors indicated the temperature outside had dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm wasn't weakening. If anything, the satellite feed suggested it was growing stronger, part of a massive weather system that stretched from the Arctic to Mexico. The normal jet stream had collapsed entirely, just as his dismissed research had predicted 5 years ago. Marcus descended the hidden staircase behind his basement wall, past 3 security doors that required both biometric scans and encrypted keycards. The artificial lights grew brighter as he walked deeper, and the temperature rose to a comfortable 72 degrees. The air smelled rich and earthy, carrying the sweet scent of growing things. The main chamber opened before him like a cathedral of green. Hydroponic towers stretched 30 feet toward the reinforced concrete ceiling, heavy with tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, and dozens of other vegetables. Automated systems hummed quietly, monitoring pH levels, nutrient distribution, and growth cycles. Fish tanks lined one wall, part of an aquaponics system that provided protein while filtering water for the plants. LED arrays mimicked perfect sunlight, powered by geothermal generators buried even deeper underground. It had taken him 3 years to build and 2 more years to perfect. Every system had backup systems. The facility could run completely sealed for decades if necessary, recycling air and water in an endless loop. He'd tested every component obsessively, knowing he might get only one chance to prove his worth. But perfecting the technology had been the easy part. The impossible part was deciding who deserved to enter his sanctuary. Marcus pulled up the town directory on his tablet, cross-referencing it with the camera feeds. Millbrook had just over 2,000 residents. His facility could sustain 500 at most without risking system failure. That meant 1,800 people would die if he opened his doors. The Hendersons had 2 young children. Mrs. Patterson had been kind to him when others mocked his project, bringing him homemade cookies during the construction. Dr. Sarah Williams at the clinic would be essential for medical care. But what about Principal Morris, who had publicly called him a lunatic at town meetings, or Mayor Duncan, who had tried to have his project shut down as a public nuisance? His brother James lived 6 blocks away with his wife and teenage daughter. They hadn't spoken since James accused him of wasting their parents' inheritance on his doomsday fantasy. The cameras showed their house dark and still, probably conserving what little heat they could generate. An alert chimed on his workstation. Movement sensors detected someone approaching his property through the storm. Marcus switched to the exterior cameras, adjusting for the blowing snow and darkness. A figure stumbled through the drifts, bundled in layers of clothing, moving slowly toward his front door. As the person drew closer, Marcus recognized the bright red parka. Jenny Walsh, the 8-year-old girl from 3 houses down. She fell twice in the deep snow before reaching his porch, her small fists pounding weakly against his reinforced front door. Marcus watched her through the camera, his finger hovering over the intercom button. Behind him, the underground farm hummed with life and abundance. Above him, a child was freezing to death on his doorstep, while her town slowly starved in the endless winter. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than he'd expected. Once he opened that door, once people knew what he'd built, there would be no going back. The pounding grew weaker. The emergency broadcast cut through the static at 6:47 a.m., jolting Marcus Holloway from his restless sleep on the laboratory cot. He'd been dreaming of tomatoes again, rows upon rows of perfect red spheres hanging heavy on their vines, glowing under the artificial suns he'd spent 15 years perfecting. Unprecedented storm system has stalled over the northern hemisphere. Temperatures have dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit in Chicago, -32 in Atlanta. The National Weather Service warns this is not a temporary cold snap. Satellite data suggests the jet stream has fundamentally shifted, locking the continent in what meteorologists are calling a polar prison. Marcus rolled off the narrow cot and padded barefoot across the concrete floor to his control panel. 60 feet below the surface of what had once been his grandmother's farm in rural Ohio, his life's work hummed quietly in climate-controlled perfection. The main cavern stretched nearly 2 acres, carved from limestone with machinery he'd bought piece by piece over the years, funded by patents no one understood and grants from foundations that humored his doomsday fantasies. The vertical growing towers rose like geometric trees throughout the space, their LED arrays casting everything in an otherworldly purple glow. Hydroponic lettuce cascaded in perfect spirals, protein-rich algae bubbled in glass containers, and in the crown jewel of his design, the greenhouse dome at the cavern's heart, actual soil supported actual plants in something approaching natural sunlight. His fingers flew across the tablet, checking moisture levels, nutrient flows, and temperature readings. Everything optimal. The geothermal heating system he'd tapped into maintained a steady 72 degrees regardless of the apocalypse raging above. The emergency broadcast continued. Grocery stores report complete depletion of supplies. Transportation networks remain paralyzed. Federal authorities urge citizens to remain indoors and conserve heating fuel. Recovery efforts are hampered by equipment failures in extreme cold. Marcus had tried to warn them. 5 years ago, standing before the Senate Subcommittee on Climate Change, he'd presented his data. The models all pointed to the same conclusion. Gradual warming would trigger a catastrophic tipping point, destabilizing ocean currents and atmospheric patterns. The result wouldn't be a gentle slide into uninhabitable heat, but a violent snap into an ice age. Senator Richardson had actually laughed. "Mr. Holloway, you're asking us to spend billions on underground farms for a science fiction scenario. The scientific consensus is clear. Global warming means rising temperatures, not an ice age. Respectfully, Senator, the scientific consensus said the Titanic was unsinkable. They dismissed him as a crackpot, a fearmonger. The media dubbed him the Mole Man after photos leaked of him emerging dirt-covered from his excavation site. Late-night comedians made jokes about his bunker vegetables, but Marcus had kept digging, kept planting, kept preparing. The proximity alarm chimed. Someone was on the surface, near the concealed entrance. Marcus switched to the security feed, expecting to see a lost government official or desperate neighbor. Instead, he found Dr. Elena Vasquez crouched beside the camouflaged hatch, her dark hair whipping in the brutal wind. He knew Elena from the climate conferences, where they'd both been marginalized voices. She'd been studying atmospheric chemistry while he'd been perfecting cold-resistant crop strains. Her research had supported his dire predictions, earning her the same professional exile he'd endured. Marcus grabbed a thermal jacket and climbed the service ladder to the surface. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. Elena's lips were blue, her entire body shaking violently. "Elena, how did you—" "Tracked your geothermal signature," she gasped through chattering teeth. "Thermal imaging from the university before the satellites went down. Marcus, you were right about everything." He helped her down the ladder, sealing the hatch against the howling wind. In the blessed warmth of the cavern, Elena stared around in wonder at his underground Eden. "My God," she whispered. "How much food can this produce?" Marcus ran calculations he'd memorized years ago. Full capacity, enough to sustain maybe 200 people indefinitely. I'm currently growing enough for 50. There are thousands trapped in the city, maybe millions across the region. I know. Elena turned to face him, and he saw the question in her eyes before she spoke it. The same question that had kept him awake for 3 nights straight as the reports grew more desperate. "So, how do we decide who gets to live?" Outside, the wind howled like something dying. In the distance, Marcus could hear what sounded like gunshots, or maybe it was just trees snapping under the weight of ice. His sensors showed the surface temperature dropping another degree. He looked at his perfect rows of vegetables, his carefully balanced ecosystem, his life's work that could save some but never all. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple, but the human equation was infinitely complex. "I don't know," he admitted, "but people are going to start figuring out we're here soon, and when they do—" The generator's hum had grown irregular over the past 3 days, a metallic wheeze that made Elena's stomach clench every time it stuttered. She pressed her ear against the housing, listening to the diesel engine's labored breathing like a doctor checking a dying patient's heartbeat. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining. "How long?" Marcus asked from behind her, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. 2 weeks if we're lucky, maybe 10 days if this cold snap continues." Elena straightened, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades. The engine's working twice as hard to keep the heat exchangers running. Marcus nodded grimly. Above them, through 18 feet of earth and reinforced concrete, the wind howled with a fury that had been building for 72 hours straight. The weather station's last transmission before it went silent had recorded temperatures dropping to -47 degrees Fahrenheit. The backup systems Elena had installed were keeping the underground farm at a stable 68 degrees, but that delicate balance depended entirely on the generator's cooperation. "The Hendersons are asking about their son again," Marcus said, settling onto a crate of spare parts. "They know David didn't make it to the shelter in time." Elena had been dreading this conversation. Young David Henderson, barely 19, had been caught outside when the blizzard hit. They'd found him 200 yards from the entrance, frozen solid beneath 3 feet of snow. His parents, safely ensconced in the dormitory section of the compound, still held on to hope that their boy might have found shelter elsewhere. "We can't keep lying to them," Elena said, though the words tasted like ash. "Can't tell them the truth either. Not yet. Margaret Henderson has been helping with the seedling transplants. If she breaks down—" Marcus left the sentence hanging, but Elena understood. They needed every capable hand. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. The hydroponics bay stretched out before them, a cathedral of green in an increasingly grey world. Rows of lettuce, tomatoes and soybeans grew under full-spectrum LED arrays that Elena had designed to maximize yield per watt. The system was a marvel of efficiency, capable of feeding 200 people indefinitely under normal circumstances. But nothing about their situation was normal. They currently housed 47 survivors, with more arriving every few days. Each new mouth to feed meant recalculating the equations that kept them all alive. Elena had run the numbers so many times she could recite them in her sleep. Current crop yield, projected harvest dates, caloric requirements per person, seed stock reserves, the mathematics of survival. "Dr. Valdez wants to see you," Marcus said, checking his watch. "She's in the medical bay." Elena found Dr. Carmen Valdez bent over her tablet, updating patient files by the light of a single LED strip. The medical bay occupied what had once been Elena's workshop, hastily converted when it became clear they'd need more than just a first aid kit to keep people alive. "We have a problem," Carmen said without preamble. "Mrs. Chen's diabetes is getting worse. Her blood sugar's been spiking despite the medication rationing." Elena felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. How much insulin does she need? Proper dosage? She'd burned through our entire supply in 6 weeks, but without it. Carmen shrugged helplessly. Maybe 3 months before complications set in. Mrs. Chen was 68 years old, a retired librarian who'd been helping organize their resource inventory with meticulous care. She was also the grandmother to twin boys, Tommy and Jake, whose parents hadn't survived the first wave of the storm. Elena had watched those boys clinging to their grandmother like she was the last solid thing in a crumbling world. "What about half doses?" Elena asked. "Might buy us time, but it's not sustainable, and if others develop medical needs," Carmen gestured toward the settlement beyond the medical bay walls. "We're playing a very dangerous game here, Elena." A sharp bang echoed through the compound, followed by shouting. Elena and Carmen rushed toward the sound, finding a crowd gathered around the entrance tunnel. 2 figures in snow-caked clothing stood in the decontamination chamber, their faces blue with cold. Elena recognized them immediately. Paul Brennan, the town's former mayor, and his teenage daughter Sarah. She'd seen them at the emergency town meetings before the storm hit, back when people still believed government assistance was coming. "Please," Brennan gasped, his words barely intelligible through chattering teeth. "We've been walking for days. The school shelter collapsed under the snow. Everyone—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elena looked at the newcomers, then at the faces of her existing community. 47 had become 49. The equations in her head began recalculating automatically. Food stores, medical supplies, fuel consumption, living space. 2 more variables in an already impossible equation. "Get them warmed up and fed," she heard herself saying. "We'll figure out the rest later." But even as she spoke the words, Elena knew there was no later. Every decision was immediate, final, irreversible. The mathematics of survival had no room for sentiment, yet somehow she kept finding herself choosing humanity over numbers. The generator wheezed again, and Elena wondered how much longer she could keep making choices that defied her own calculations. The generator's familiar hum filled the silence as Marcus descended into the heart of his creation. 3 levels down now, past the hydroponic towers and seed banks, into what he privately called the engine room. Here, massive batteries lined the walls like sleeping giants, their LED indicators pulsing in rhythm with the geothermal pumps that kept everything alive. Sarah followed close behind, her flashlight beam dancing across the machinery. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the children upstairs, but Marcus could feel the weight of her unasked questions. "How long have you been planning this?" she finally said. Marcus paused at the main control panel, his fingers hovering over the switches that regulated their underground world. The honest answer was 15 years, ever since the first climate reports had crossed his desk at the university, back when his colleagues still called him paranoid. "Long enough," he said instead. The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell above. Marcus tensed, but relaxed when he recognized the heavy tread of Dr. Chen. The older man appeared at the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard from the climb, his medical bag clutched in one hand. "The Peterson boy is stabilized," Chen announced, setting his bag down carefully. "But he needs antibiotics soon, or the pneumonia will spread to the others." Marcus nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. Antibiotics were one of the many supplies he'd stockpiled, but not in unlimited quantities. Every dose given to young Tommy Peterson was one less for someone else who might need it later. "There's something else," Chen continued, his voice dropping. "I've been monitoring the radio frequencies. The emergency broadcast stopped 3 hours ago." Sarah's flashlight beam faltered. "All of them. All of them." Chen's weathered face looked grim in the artificial light. "Either the station's lost power, or..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Marcus turned back to the control panel, using the moment to hide his expression. He'd expected this, had planned for it even, but hearing the confirmation still hit him like a physical blow. The outside world was dying faster than anyone had predicted. "How many people can this place actually support?" Sarah asked quietly. The question Marcus had been dreading. He'd run the calculations countless times, had optimized every system for maximum efficiency. The truth was a number that haunted his dreams. 42 people, he said, for approximately 8 months, assuming the geothermal system holds and we maintain strict rationing protocols. And after 8 months, the winter should break. Temperatures should start to normalize. Should. The word hung in the air like a prayer. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How many people are upstairs right now?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He walked to the far end of the room where a small observation window looked out into one of the growing chambers. Rows of vegetables stretched out under artificial suns, a green oasis in their buried world. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a countdown timer. 38, he said finally. "So we're okay then. We have room for 4 more. Marcus turned around slowly. Sarah was looking at him with something approaching relief, as if the math was that simple. Chen, however, was watching Marcus with the sharp eyes of a man who understood that numbers were never just numbers. "That's assuming no one else finds us," Marcus said. "That's assuming the people upstairs never have children. That's assuming perfect health, no accidents, no complications." He gestured toward Chen. "How realistic are those assumptions, Doctor?" Chen's silence was answer enough. The sound of voices drifted down from above, faint but audible through the ventilation system. Families settling in for the night, children asking when they could go home, adults whispering reassurances they didn't believe themselves, 38 people who trusted him to keep them alive. But Marcus knew what Sarah and Chen didn't yet understand. The radio might have gone silent, but the motion sensors around his property hadn't. 3 separate groups had already tried to approach the farm in the past 6 hours. So far, the snow and the carefully disguised entrances had kept them hidden, but that wouldn't last forever. Soon, he would have to choose. Not just how to allocate medicine or food, but something far worse. He would have to decide who deserved to live and who would be left outside in the killing cold. The generator's hum seemed louder now, more insistent, or maybe that was just the sound of time running out. "We should get some rest," Marcus said, moving toward the stairs. "Tomorrow will be harder." Sarah fell into step beside him, but Chen lingered by the control panel, studying the readouts with professional interest. "Marcus," he called softly, "those motion sensors of yours, how many people are we talking about?" Marcus paused on the first step. "Does it matter?" "It will," Chen said, "when they start knocking." The generator's rhythmic hum had become Marcus's heartbeat over the past 3 days. He'd memorized every vibration, every slight variation in pitch that might signal trouble. When the sound shifted to a higher whine at 3 a.m., he bolted upright from his makeshift bed in the control room. The fuel gauge needle trembled dangerously close to empty. Marcus ran his hands through his unwashed hair, calculating. At current consumption, they had maybe 18 hours before everything went dark. The hydroponics would fail first, then the heating system. The crops would freeze within hours, and everyone sheltering in his underground sanctuary would follow soon after. He'd known this moment would come, but hoping and knowing were different animals entirely. The knock on the control room door was soft but insistent. Sarah entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 steaming cups of what passed for coffee these days, chicory root and recycled grounds. "You're rationing fuel," she said, settling beside him at the console. It wasn't a question. Marcus accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the weak but warm aroma. "We're burning through diesel faster than anticipated. The cold above ground is worse than my calculations predicted." "How much time?" "Less than a day." Sarah's face remained calm, but her knuckles whitened around her cup. As the former city planning director, she understood resource management. She also understood what came next. "The Hendersons have been asking about their daughter again," she said quietly. "Emma's been coughing for 2 days now. They want to take her to a hospital." Marcus almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "What hospital? The emergency broadcast stopped 3 days ago." "I know that. You know that. But their parents, Marcus. Hope doesn't follow logic." Through the control room's small window, Marcus could see into the main growing chamber. 37 people moved between the hydroponic towers like ghosts in green-tinged light. 3 families, 8 individuals, 4 elderly couples, and a handful of graduate students who'd been helping with his research when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. 37 lives depending on choices he'd never wanted to make. "There's a fuel depot 12 miles north," Marcus said finally. "Commercial trucking station. If it hasn't been completely looted, there might be enough diesel to last us another week. 12 miles in this weather is suicide. Staying here without fuel is suicide too." Sarah studied his face. "You're thinking about going yourself. I built this place. I'm responsible for everyone here. You're also the only one who understands the systems. If something breaks while you're gone..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew the facility was held together by Marcus's intimate knowledge of every jury-rigged component, every workaround he'd installed during 5 years of building in secret. "Then I send someone else," Marcus said, the words tasting like ash. "Who?" The question hung between them like a blade. The grad students were young but inexperienced with the brutal cold above. The families wouldn't leave their children. The elderly couldn't make the journey. "Jake Morrison," Sarah said quietly. "He's got military training, no dependents here." Marcus knew Jake, a former army engineer who'd arrived 2 days ago after his apartment building's heating failed. Competent, tough, alone. Also someone who'd trusted Marcus's promise of safety. "I can't just send a man to his death. You can't let 36 other people die either." "There's another option," Sarah said. "We reduce the load, turn off heating to the outer chambers, concentrate everyone in the main growing area. The seed banks are in those chambers. Our genetic diversity for replanting. Seeds don't die from cold the way people do." Marcus stared at the fuel gauge. The needle hadn't moved, but he could feel the reserves draining like his own blood. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Weather reports before the communications blackout had predicted temperatures dropping another 20 degrees. "Get Jake," he said finally. "I'll prepare a map to the depot and give him the override codes for the fuel pumps." Sarah stood slowly, her coffee untouched and cooling. "Marcus, don't." He couldn't look at her. "Just tell him I'm sorry. Tell him it's not an order. Tell him he's free to say no." After she left, Marcus sat alone with the dying generator and the weight of mathematics. 37 lives minus 1, multiplied by 1 week of survival, divided by hope that rescue might come. He'd built this place to save humanity from its own short-sightedness. He'd never calculated that salvation would require him to become the very thing he'd always despised, someone who decided who deserved to live. The emergency broadcast crackled through Marcus's jury-rigged radio system, filling the underground chambers with static-laden desperation. "Repeat, all government emergency shelters in the tri-state area have exceeded capacity. Citizens are advised to remain indoors and conserve all available food sources. Current temperature, -42 degrees Fahrenheit." Sarah switched off the radio with a sharp click. "That's the 4th shelter that's gone dark this week." Her voice carried the weight of numbers they both understood but refused to speak aloud. Marcus stood among his hydroponic towers, watching tomatoes ripen under artificial suns while the world above them died. The irony tasted bitter. 3 months ago, the scientific community had dismissed his work as fantasy. Now those same skeptics were probably frozen corpses buried under 20 feet of snow. "How many more?" Sarah asked, pulling her tablet from a charging station powered by the geothermal grid Marcus had installed years earlier, back when people called him paranoid. 17 responded to our last transmission. All families. 43 people total. Marcus plucked a cherry tomato, its warmth a small miracle in his palm. The Hendersons made it to the outer tunnel yesterday. Hypothermia took the grandfather before I could get them inside. Sarah's fingers moved across her tablet, updating their impossible ledger. Resources versus lives. Mathematics made monstrous by necessity. The protein farms are producing ahead of schedule, but if we take in all 43, we'll have enough food for maybe 2 months. Marcus finished the calculation they'd run dozens of times. After that, people start dying anyway. The weight of playing God pressed against his chest like a physical thing. Every morning brought new voices on the radio, families trapped in cars, communities cut off by impassable drifts, children crying for help that might not come. The farm could sustain perhaps 60 people indefinitely. Any more, and they'd all starve together. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been monitoring military frequencies." Marcus felt his stomach clench. "And they know about us, not the location, but they know someone's got a functioning agricultural operation. The chatter suggests they're preparing search teams." The tools in Marcus's hands suddenly felt foreign, like artifacts from a simpler time when his biggest worry was convincing investors that vertical farming could be profitable. Now those same systems represented the difference between civilization's survival and its extinction. How long before they find us? Hard to say. The storms are buying us time, but once they clear— Sarah gestured toward the reinforced ceiling above them. "Military-grade thermal imaging will pick up our heat signature eventually." Marcus moved through the growing chambers, checking nutrient levels with practiced efficiency. The plants didn't care about the moral calculus destroying his sleep. They simply grew, transformed carefully balanced solutions into sustenance, obeyed the ancient contract between seed and soil that predated human civilization. "The military will want to federalize the operation," he said, already knowing where that path led. "Turn us into a government facility, which means they'll decide who gets saved." Sarah's tablet chimed with another incoming transmission. "And people like us become expendable." The newest message contained coordinates for a family of 5 holed up in a convenience store 40 miles north. The father's voice cracked as he described his youngest daughter's fever, how they'd run out of formula 2 days ago. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to summon the man who'd built this place, the obsessive genius convinced he could engineer solutions to problems others couldn't even see coming. That man had prepared for climate disaster, for social collapse, for the failure of global agriculture. But he'd never prepared for this, the daily choice between salvation and survival. "We can't save everyone," Sarah said, echoing thoughts that had become a mantra of survival. "I know." The words felt like swallowing glass. "But we have to save someone." Movement in the outer tunnels interrupted their conversation. Footsteps echoing through the emergency access shaft Marcus had carved into the hillside. He grabbed the shotgun he'd started keeping near the main console, muscle memory from hunting trips with his father translating into something darker. 3 figures emerged from the tunnel, a woman clutching an infant, a boy maybe 10 years old, and an elderly man who moved with the careful steps of someone conserving every calorie. The Henderson family, minus 1 member claimed by the cold. Mrs. Henderson looked around the underground farm with wonder and desperation warring in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, holding her baby closer. "We have nowhere else to go." Marcus felt the weight of every choice he hadn't yet made pressing down on him. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the surface world. Down here, surrounded by the green promise of engineered hope, he would have to decide once again who deserved to live. The generator coughed like a dying man, its rhythm stuttering in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus jolted awake in his chair, the sound cutting through his exhausted sleep like a blade. 3 weeks of rationing fuel, and now their lifeline was failing. He stumbled through the underground corridors, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees overnight. Above ground, the blizzard had been raging for 6 days straight, and the solar panels were buried under 12 feet of snow. In the generator room, Elena was already working, her medical training making her hands steady even as her face showed the strain they all felt. "It's the fuel injection system," she said without looking up. "We've been running it too hard for too long. How long do we have? On backup power? Maybe 18 hours if we shut down everything non-essential." Marcus ran calculations in his head. Non-essential meant the lower greenhouse levels, where they were growing the winter wheat that wouldn't be ready for another month. It meant shutting down the water purification system and relying on their dwindling reserves. It meant choosing which crops lived and which died. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice dropping. "David's getting worse." The boy had been with them since the first week, when his parents had frozen to death trying to reach the farm. At 12, he was the youngest of their group of 37 survivors. The infection in his leg had started small, but without proper antibiotics, it was spreading. Sarah thinks she can synthesize penicillin using the lab equipment, but it would take power we don't have. And time. Marcus closed his eyes. Every decision was a death sentence for someone. Save the boy and risk the crops that could feed them all. Save the crops and watch a child die. The mathematics of survival had no room for mercy. A new voice cut through his thoughts. "There's another option." They turned to find Dr. Chen standing in the doorway, his face haggard but determined. The former government climatologist had arrived 3 days ago, half dead from exposure, carrying news that made their situation even more desperate. The research station 40 miles north. They had emergency fuel reserves. Marcus shook his head. "We've been through this. It's suicide. The surface temperature hit -60 yesterday." "Not for everyone," Chen replied. "But one person, with the right equipment, moving fast. It's possible." Elena stepped between them. "Nobody's going anywhere. We stick together or we die together." But Marcus was already thinking through the logistics. The old snowcat in the upper garage might still run. The emergency thermal suits could buy maybe 4 hours in the cold. It would have to be enough. "I'll go," he said quietly. "Like hell you will." Elena's voice was sharp. "You're the only one who understands all the systems. You die out there, and we all die down here. Then who?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. They all knew the answer. Tom Williams had been a long-distance trucker before the freeze, knew how to navigate in impossible conditions. He was also dying, had been since the cancer diagnosis 6 months ago. In the old world, he might have had 2 years. Down here, sharing rations and breathing recycled air, he had maybe 2 months. When they found Tom in the common area, sharing his breakfast ration with 2 of the younger survivors, Marcus almost couldn't bring himself to ask. But the generator's uneven rhythm reminded him that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. Tom listened to the plan without interruption, his weathered face showing no emotion. When Marcus finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "How much fuel?" "Enough for 6 months, maybe 8 if we're careful." "And if I don't make it back?" Marcus met his eyes. "Then we make 18 hours last as long as we can." Tom nodded slowly. "When do I leave?" 2 hours. The storm's supposed to ease up around dawn." As they prepared the snowcat and loaded the thermal suits, Marcus tried not to think about what they were asking. Tom had family photos in his bunk, grandchildren he would never see again. He'd been a good man in the old world, and he was a good man now, even if goodness had been redefined by necessity. The garage door opened onto a hellscape of white. The wind immediately drove snow into their faces, and even with the thermal suits, the cold was a living thing that tried to crawl inside their bones. Tom climbed into the snowcat, his movements careful and deliberate. Through the windshield, his face was already pale, but his hands were steady on the controls. 40 miles, Marcus shouted over the wind. "Follow the ridgeline. If the fuel is gone—" "I know." Tom's voice was calm. "Take care of them." The snowcat disappeared into the storm within seconds, swallowed by the white void that had become their world. Marcus stood watching until Elena pulled him back inside, back to the warmth and the dying generator and the impossible choices that never seemed to end. The generator's rhythmic hum had become Marcus's heartbeat over the past 3 days. He pressed his ear against the metal housing, listening for any variation in its mechanical pulse. The vibration felt different, not quite right, like a car engine running on its last cylinder. "How much longer?" Sarah asked from behind him, her voice tight with exhaustion. She'd been helping him monitor the systems around the clock, catching sleep in 15-minute intervals between status checks. Marcus pulled back from the generator, wiping grease from his hands. "Maybe 6 hours, maybe 12. The bearings are shot, and we're running on fumes." He gestured toward the fuel gauge, its needle hovering dangerously close to empty. "Even if the storm breaks tomorrow, we don't have enough power to last." The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. Without the generator, the heating systems would fail within hours. The hydroponic gardens would freeze. Everything they'd built, everything that kept 43 people alive in this concrete tomb, would become worthless. Elena appeared at the bottom of the maintenance ladder, her face grim. "We've got another problem. Chen's getting worse. His fever spiked again, and now Rodriguez is showing symptoms too." Marcus closed his eyes. The infection had started with Thompson 2 days ago, a simple cut that had somehow turned septic, despite their limited medical supplies. They'd isolated him in one of the storage rooms, but diseases didn't respect makeshift quarantine protocols. How many more? Sarah asked the question they were all thinking. "Dr. Reeves thinks it could spread to anyone with a compromised immune system. That's basically everyone after 3 weeks of rationed food and stress." Elena's voice cracked slightly. "She's asking for more antibiotics, but we only have enough for maybe 3 more people." The weight of leadership pressed down on Marcus's shoulders like a physical force. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a crazy inventor with delusions of grandeur. Now 43 lives hung on his every decision, and he was failing them one choice at a time. "There's something else," Elena continued, lowering her voice. "Some of the others are talking about the sick ones. They're scared the infection will spread, and they're suggesting—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus understood. In desperate times, people reverted to survival instincts that civilization had tried to bury. The same neighbors who once borrowed sugar and helped with yard work were now calculating who deserved to live and who was expendable. "No," he said firmly, "we don't abandon people. That's not who we are. But if the generator fails and half our people are sick, then we find another way." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Marcus, you can't save everyone. Sometimes the best choice is the one that saves the most people, even if it means—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. He pulled away from her touch, unable to bear the sympathy in her eyes. "There has to be another option. The backup generator in Section C is smaller and already powering life support for the East Wing," Elena interrupted. "We've been over this. Even if we could reroute power, it wouldn't be enough for the whole facility." Marcus began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities he'd already considered and discarded. The spare parts were insufficient. The fuel reserves were depleted. The storm showed no signs of abating, and their radio equipment had been picking up nothing but static for days. For all they knew, they were the last pocket of humanity left alive. "What about rationing power?" he asked desperately. "We could shut down non-essential systems, maybe cut heating to some sections." "We're already at minimum power," Sarah said. "Any less, and the hydroponic systems fail. Without fresh produce, we'll lose people to malnutrition within days." The truth was inescapable. They were facing a mathematical equation where the variables were human lives, and there was no solution that didn't involve subtraction. A new sound reached them from above, voices raised in argument. The tensions that had been building for days were finally boiling over. Marcus could make out individual words: sick, waste, survival. His carefully maintained community was fracturing along the fault lines of fear and desperation. "I have to go up there," he said, starting toward the ladder. "Marcus, wait." Elena grabbed his arm. "Before you do, you need to know, some of them approached me yesterday. They want to call a vote, about leadership, about how decisions get made." He stopped, understanding flooding through him. They were planning a coup, disguised as democracy. And honestly, he couldn't blame them. His leadership had gotten them this far, but it might not be enough to get them through what came next. Marcus looked at the failing generator, then at the two women who had become his closest allies in this underground hell. The next few hours would determine whether they emerged from this crisis as a community worth saving or as strangers who had simply shared the same tomb. The generator's familiar hum had grown irregular over the past 3 days, a stuttering rhythm that made Marcus's stomach clench each time it faltered. He crouched beside the massive machine in the facility's bowels, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air. Even down here, 60 feet below ground, the relentless winter was seeping through their defenses. Elena appeared beside him, her tablet glowing with diagnostic readings. "The fuel reserves are dropping faster than projected. At this rate, we have maybe 2 weeks before we're running on fumes." "And the hydroponics bay?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Temperatures dropped 4 degrees since yesterday. The outer crops are already showing signs of stress." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If we lose heating entirely, everything dies within 72 hours. Marcus straightened, his joints protesting the cold. Through the facility's narrow windows, he could see the endless wall of white that had become their world. The storm that had raged for 5 days straight showed no signs of abating. Weather reports, when they could get them, spoke of unprecedented Arctic conditions, extending across 3 continents. "Sir?" Sarah's voice crackled through the comm system. "We've got another group at the main entrance." Marcus climbed the stairs to the control room, Elena close behind. On the security monitor he could see them, 7 figures hunched against the wind, barely visible through the driving snow. A woman held something bundled close to her chest, and Marcus realized with a sick feeling that it was a child. "They've been out there for 20 minutes, Sarah reported. "The woman keeps looking directly at the camera. She knows we can see her." "How many does that make this week?" Elena asked. 14 groups, maybe 60 people total." Sarah's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the strain beneath it. He stared at the monitor, watching the small group huddle together for warmth. The facility was designed for 30 people maximum. They currently housed 47, and every addition strained their resources further. The math was brutal and unavoidable. More people meant less time for everyone. "Sir?" Dr. Vance's voice came from behind them. The older man looked haggard, his usually pristine appearance disheveled. "I need to speak with you about the rationing schedule." Marcus didn't turn away from the screen. "What about it?" "Current consumption rates suggest we need to reduce food allocation by another 15%. The newer arrivals are struggling with the current portions." "The newer arrivals," Elena said sharply, "are lucky to be alive." "They're also our responsibility now," Vance replied. "Several are showing signs of severe malnutrition. If we don't increase their intake, we'll lose them anyway." Marcus watched the woman on the monitor adjust her grip on the child. A gust of wind nearly knocked her over, but she planted her feet and held firm. Determination radiated from her posture even through the grainy footage. "What about the Wilson group?" he asked. 6 people who'd arrived 3 days ago, including an elderly man whose persistent cough echoed through the facility's corridors. "Mr. Wilson's condition is deteriorating rapidly. The others, they're consuming resources at above-average rates due to their physical condition when they arrived." The implication hung in the air like a poison cloud. Marcus had seen this conversation coming for days, had felt it building like pressure behind a dam. Every leader of every group that had survived this long had faced the same impossible calculus. "We're not throwing people out," Marcus said finally. "Not suggesting we throw anyone out," Vance replied carefully. "I'm simply noting that nature has a way of making these decisions for us. Some people are more likely to survive than others. Some require more resources to sustain. In a crisis situation, these factors become relevant. Elena's face had gone pale. You're talking about letting people die. I'm talking about acknowledging reality. This facility cannot sustain unlimited growth. Every person we save now potentially costs us the ability to save others later. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. Through the monitor, he watched the woman with the child finally turn away from the camera, leading her group back into the storm. Whether she was giving up or looking for another entrance, he couldn't tell. "Run the numbers," he said quietly. "All of them. Current consumption rates, projected fuel usage, crop yields under varying temperature scenarios. I want a complete analysis by tomorrow morning." "And the group outside?" Sarah asked. Marcus stared at the empty screen where the figures had disappeared into the white void. Somewhere out there, people were making the choice between approaching strangers for help and maintaining their dignity in death. Inside these walls, he was being asked to choose between his humanity and his responsibility to those already under his protection. "Lock down the facility," he said, the words tasting like ash. "No one else comes in tonight." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the generator's increasingly labored breathing. The emergency siren's wail pierced through the underground facility at 3:47 a.m., jolting Marcus from his restless sleep. He stumbled from his cot, bare feet hitting the cold concrete as red warning lights bathed the corridors in an ominous glow. The hydroponics bay, something was catastrophically wrong. Elena was already there when he arrived, her face pale in the emergency lighting as she frantically worked at the main control panel. Steam rose from the growing beds, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. "Talk to me," Marcus said, pulling up diagnostics on a secondary terminal. "Primary heating system failed 20 minutes ago," Elena replied, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The backup kicked in, but it's overloading. If we lose heat regulation, we'll lose everything. The entire crop, the seedlings, all of it." Marcus's blood ran cold. The underground farm operated on razor-thin margins, every plant accounted for, every calorie calculated. Losing the current harvest would mean death sentences for half the people depending on them above. Can we repair the primary system? Not without parts we don't have. The thermal regulators are fried, complete system failure. Elena's fingers flew over the controls as she tried to stabilize the backup. Even if we had them, it would take days. The facility's population had swelled to nearly 300 people in the past week. Word had spread despite Marcus's attempts at secrecy, and desperate families kept appearing at the hidden entrances. Each new arrival meant fewer resources for everyone, but how could he turn away a mother with starving children? How could he close the doors on the elderly who'd frozen in their homes when the power grid finally collapsed? "What about the eastern growing section?" Marcus asked, studying the thermal readings. "If we shut down half the facility, concentrate all heating on the critical crops, we'd save maybe 60% of the harvest," Elena interrupted. "But the sections we shut down would be total losses. Marcus, that's food for over 100 people." The weight of the choice pressed down on him like a physical force. Save 60% and let 40% die, or risk losing everything trying to maintain the impossible balance. In the old world, this would have been a mathematical equation. In this new reality, it was a choice between specific faces, real people whose names he knew. Through the observation window, he could see some of the night shift workers tending to the vertical gardens, unaware of the crisis unfolding. Mrs. Chen, who'd arrived 3 days ago with her 2 grandchildren after their apartment building lost heat. David Rodriguez, the young teacher who'd organized classes for the children to keep their minds occupied. Sarah Mills, barely 18, who'd been pregnant when she arrived and was now nursing a newborn in the makeshift nursery. "Show me the projections again," Marcus said quietly. Elena pulled up the calculations she'd been running. "If we implement rolling blackouts in the living sections, reduce heating by 30%, we might be able to maintain minimal growing conditions across 80% of the facility." But people will suffer. Some of the elderly, the sick, they might not survive the cold. Marcus closed his eyes. When he'd first built this place, it was supposed to be his sanctuary, his proof that sustainable agriculture could work even in the worst conditions. He'd never imagined being forced to play God, deciding who lived and who died with engineering calculations and resource allocation spreadsheets. "There's another option," Elena said hesitantly. "I've been running numbers on selective admission protocols. If we reduced our population by about 50 people, sent them to other shelters." "What other shelters?" Marcus's voice was harsher than he intended. "Elena, you've seen the reports. The government facilities are overwhelmed. The aid stations have been overrun. Where exactly would we send them?" The silence stretched between them as the truth hung unspoken. There was nowhere else. This underground farm, this impossible dream that everyone had mocked, really was humanity's last hope in this frozen hellscape. The backup heating system chose that moment to emit a grinding sound that made them both wince. Elena checked the readings and shook her head. 15 minutes, maybe 20 before it fails completely. Marcus made his decision. Implement the rolling blackouts. Shut down the eastern sections 3 and 4. They have the lowest yield crops anyway. Route all available power to the primary growing areas and maintain life support at minimum viable levels. He paused, hating himself for the words that came next. "And Elena? No more new admissions. We're at capacity." Elena nodded grimly and began implementing the protocols. As the facility's systems shifted into crisis mode, Marcus wondered how many more impossible choices lay ahead. Outside, the wind howled with the fury of a world gone mad, and inside, he fought to keep the last flicker of hope alive, even if it meant sacrificing pieces of his humanity with each decision. The temperature gauges began their slow, inevitable decline toward disaster. The emergency lights cast everything in sickly amber as Sarah descended into sub-level 3, her boots echoing against concrete walls she'd never seen before. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with moisture and the earthy smell of growing things. When she reached the bottom, her breath caught. Endless rows of hydroponic towers stretched into the darkness, their LED arrays creating a constellation of purple and white light. Lettuce, tomatoes, beans, and dozens of other crops grew in perfect spiraling columns that disappeared into the shadows. The sight was beautiful and terrible, a subterranean Eden that could feed hundreds while thousands starved above. "How long have you been planning this?" she whispered to Marcus, who stood silently beside her. 15 years, he said, ever since the first climate models showed what was coming. Elena emerged from behind a massive air filtration unit, her tablet glowing. "The atmospheric processes are running at 60% capacity. We're losing efficiency faster than expected." "The new arrivals," Marcus said grimly. "Every person we add strains the system exponentially." Sarah watched automated harvesting arms move through the crops with mechanical precision. "How many could this really sustain?" Marcus hesitated. "Long term? Maybe 300. We're currently supporting 450. The weight of those numbers settled over them like concrete. Sarah had brought nearly 100 refugees here in the past week. Each one a life saved and a burden added to an already overtaxed system. The moral calculus felt impossible. "The Jensen family came back," Elena said quietly. "They're asking about their son." Sarah's stomach tightened. Tommy Jensen, age 12, had developed pneumonia 3 days ago. In the old world, it would have been treatable. Down here, with limited medical supplies and no proper hospital equipment, it had become a death sentence. They'd sent him to the medical bay, but everyone knew it was just somewhere quieter to die. "I'll talk to them," Sarah said. "No," Marcus's voice was firm. "I will. It's my facility, my responsibility." But Sarah was already walking toward the central elevator, unable to bear the weight of his martyrdom any longer. "You can't carry all of this alone, Marcus. That's what got us here in the first place." The main level felt different now that she knew what lay beneath. Every face in the crowded corridors represented a calculation, a choice between salvation and sustainability. Children played between sleeping adults. their laughter strange and hollow in the recycled air. She found the Jensens in the makeshift cafeteria, sitting apart from the others. Mrs. Jensen's eyes were red-rimmed, while her husband stared at his untouched bowl of nutrient paste. "Sarah?" Mrs. Jensen stood quickly. "Tommy's been asking for you. The doctor says... She says there's nothing more they can do." The medical bay was really just a converted storage room with 6 cots and whatever supplies Elena had managed to salvage from the surface. Dr. Chen, a retired physician they'd found half-frozen outside a collapsed clinic, looked up when Sarah entered. "Lung function is deteriorating," she said simply, "without proper antibiotics or ventilation equipment." Tommy was awake, his breathing shallow and labored. When he saw Sarah, he managed a weak smile. "Did the tomatoes come in yet? I helped plant those." "They're beautiful," Sarah said, sitting beside his cot. "The biggest ones I've ever seen." "Good." His eyes fluttered closed. "Mom says we might not be staying much longer, that there's not enough room." Sarah's throat constricted. She hadn't realized the Jensens had been told about the capacity problems. She wondered how many others knew, how many lay awake at night calculating their own worth against the food they consumed. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. But even as she spoke, she could feel the arithmetic of survival grinding around them. Every calorie Tommy consumed was a calorie someone else couldn't have. Every day the atmospheric processes ran over capacity, brought them closer to total system failure. The brutal mathematics that Marcus had been wrestling with alone were now hers to bear as well. When she returned to the main level, she found Marcus addressing a small crowd near the entrance. His voice was steady, but she could see the exhaustion in his shoulders. "We need to establish work rotations for the farms. Everyone who's physically able needs to contribute. We also need to discuss rationing protocols." A woman with 2 young children raised her hand. "What about medical priorities? Who decides who gets treatment when supplies run low?" Marcus's pause stretched too long. Sarah stepped forward. "We decide together," she said. "All of us. These aren't decisions one person should make alone." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others looking skeptical. In the background, the facility's life support systems hummed their constant rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to an impossible choice that could no longer be delayed. The generator's dying wheeze echoed through the corridors like a death rattle. Marcus pressed his ear against the metal housing, listening to the irregular rhythm that had been keeping him awake for 3 nights. The bearing was shot, and they had maybe 12 hours before complete failure. "How bad?" Elena's voice cut through the mechanical symphony of pumps and air circulators that kept their underground world alive. Marcus straightened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "Bad enough that we need to start rationing power immediately. The backup won't handle the full load." Elena's face remained impassive, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes. In the months since the surface had become uninhabitable, she'd developed the poker face of someone who made life-and-death decisions before breakfast. Which systems are expendable? The question hung between them like a blade. Nothing was truly expendable down here. The hydroponic bays needed their grow lights. The water reclamation system required constant filtration. The air scrubbers couldn't stop without killing them all within hours. "The med bay," Marcus said finally. "We can run it on emergency power only. And," he hesitated, Sector C. Sector C housed 43 people, including the Hendricks family with their 2 young children. It was the newest section, added hastily when the first wave of refugees had arrived begging for shelter. The wiring was substandard, the insulation inadequate. How long can they survive without heat? Marcus did the math in his head, factoring in body heat, shared blankets, the thermal mass of the earth around them. Maybe 36 hours before hypothermia sets in, less for the kids. Elena nodded slowly, and he could see her cataloguing the human cost. She'd been making these calculations longer than anyone else in their underground sanctuary. Who got the last antibiotics? Who received extra food rations? Whose expertise was worth preserving at the expense of others? There might be another option, Marcus said. The storm topside has been dying down. If I could get to the surface, reach the hardware store 6 blocks north. Absolutely not. Elena's voice brooked no argument. The temperature's still -40. You'd be dead before you made it halfway. Not if I took the tunnel system. Jenkins mapped the old steam tunnels before the freeze. They connect to the basement of Morrison's hardware. Elena stared at him as if he'd suggested flying to the moon. Those tunnels flooded last spring. They're probably ice caves by now. Probably isn't certainly. The silence stretched between them, filled by the wheeze of the dying generator. Marcus could practically hear Elena's mind working, weighing his life against the lives of everyone in Sector C. You have children too, she said finally. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah and Ben were sleeping in the family quarters, trusting their father to keep the lights on and the air flowing. But if he didn't try this, if the generator failed completely, they'd all die anyway. This is what I do, Marcus said, what I've always done. Fix things that everyone else says can't be fixed. Elena laughed bitterly. You mean like the climate? Like the food system? Like civilization itself? The accusation stung because it held truth. For years before the Great Freeze, Marcus had been the man with solutions nobody wanted to hear. Solar panels when oil was cheap, underground growing systems when farmland seemed infinite, warnings about climate tipping points when the sun still shone reliably. I couldn't fix those things, he admitted, but I can fix this. Elena walked to the small window that looked out over the main growing floor. Rows of lettuce, tomatoes and soybeans stretched under LED lights, a green oasis in their concrete world. 217 people depended on this place. 217 lives resting on decisions made in rooms like this. If you die up there, she said without turning around, we lose our chief engineer and gain nothing. If I don't try, we lose everyone in Sector C for certain. Elena's reflection in the glass looked older than her 46 years. The weight of leadership had carved lines around her eyes, turned her black hair silver at the temples. She'd been a city councilwoman before the freeze, dealing with zoning disputes and budget allocations. Now she played God with human lives on a daily basis. Take Morrison with you, she said finally, and the emergency beacon. First sign of trouble, you abort and come back. Marcus felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by terror. He'd been so focused on convincing Elena to let him try that he'd avoided thinking about the reality of venturing onto the frozen hellscape above. The bearing we need, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. It's a SKF 6308. Should be in aisle 12 if the cold hasn't destroyed their inventory system. Elena finally turned from the window. Bring back whatever else you can carry. We're going to need spare parts for more than just the generator. The weight of those words settled on his shoulders as he headed for the equipment locker. Everyone was breaking down, machines and people alike. The emergency klaxon's wail cut through the hydroponic bay like a knife through silence. Elena's hands froze over the nutrient sensors she'd been calibrating, the digital readouts blurring as her pulse spiked. That sound meant only one thing: catastrophic system failure. Marcus burst through the airlock, his face ashen. The main power coupling's blown. We've got maybe 40 minutes before the backup generators fail completely. Elena's mind raced through the implications. Without power, the grow lights would die, the temperature regulation would cease, and the water pumps would stop circulating nutrients. Everything they'd built, everything that kept their small community of survivors alive, would begin dying within hours. How many people are still in the residential sectors? She asked, already moving toward the emergency equipment locker. 63 souls, Marcus replied, checking his tablet, including the Morrison family's newborn. The weight of those numbers pressed down on Elena's shoulders like a physical force. 63 people whose lives depended on decisions she was about to make in the next few minutes. She pulled out the manual override kit, her fingers trembling slightly as she sorted through the tools. There's something else, Marcus said quietly. The Brennan group is at the north entrance. They're demanding shelter again. 15 of them this time, including children. Elena's stomach clenched. The Brennan group had been surviving topside for weeks, scavenging what they could from the frozen wasteland that had once been suburbia. She'd turned them away twice before, knowing that their resources couldn't stretch to accommodate more mouths. But children changed everything. "I need to focus on the power coupling first," she said, grabbing a plasma cutter. "If we can't fix this, it won't matter who's here." They descended into the mechanical sublevel, where the air thrummed with the desperate whine of overworked machinery. The backup generators had never been designed to carry the full load for extended periods. Steam hissed from overtaxed coolant lines, and the acrid smell of burning circuitry filled the confined space. The main coupling was worse than Marcus had described. The primary conduit had melted through completely, its composite housing warped beyond any hope of repair. Elena stared at the damage, calculating and recalculating possibilities in her head. "We can reroute through the secondary array," she said finally, "but it'll reduce our power output by 30%. 30%? Marcus's voice cracked. "That means shutting down entire growing sectors." Elena nodded grimly. "Sectors 7 through 10. We'll have to sacrifice about 40% of our current crop yield." She paused, the weight of the mathematics crushing. "We'll need to reduce our population to survive the winter." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. They both understood what that meant. People would have to leave or be forced out. In the frozen hellscape above, that was equivalent to murder. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "The Brennan children, some of them are barely old enough to walk." "I know." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. She began connecting bypass cables, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind wrestled with impossible arithmetic. Food production versus human lives. Survival versus humanity. The plasma cutter sparked to life, casting eerie blue shadows on the concrete walls. As Elena worked to reroute the power systems, she thought about the Morrison baby, born just 3 weeks ago in the depths of their underground sanctuary. She thought about old Pete, whose arthritis made him nearly useless for manual labor, but whose stories kept the children from despair during the long, dark hours. She thought about the Brennan children, huddled somewhere above in the deadly cold. "There," she said, as the last connection sealed. Emergency lighting flickered back to life throughout the facility, and the reassuring hum of the hydroponic systems resumed. But it was a hollow victory. Marcus checked his readings. Power levels stabilizing at 68% of normal. The reroute worked, but now we have to decide who stays and who goes. Elena set down her tools and looked at her friend. "Or we let the Brennan group in and watch everyone starve together." A new sound echoed through the facility, the bang of fists against the reinforced entrance doors. The Brennan group wasn't going to wait much longer for an answer. Elena could hear muffled voices, including what sounded like a crying child. "There's a third option," Marcus said slowly. "The emergency protocols you designed, the deep hibernation chambers." Elena felt her blood turn to ice. The hibernation system was untested, designed as a last resort for the final stages of civilizational collapse. Putting people into artificial comas would reduce their caloric needs to almost nothing, but the risks were enormous. Some might never wake up. Above them, the pounding on the doors grew more insistent. Time was running out, and Elena realized that keeping people alive might require making them something less than living. The choice was no longer between life and death, but between consciousness and oblivion. The alarm's shrill cry cut through the underground facility like a blade. Marcus bolted upright from his makeshift bed, his heart hammering against his ribs as emergency lights bathed everything in hellish red. The hydroponic bays stretched before him in the crimson glow, his life's work suddenly looking fragile and alien. "What's happening?" Sarah's voice cracked as she stumbled from the adjoining sleeping area, her medical bag already clutched in her hands, a reflex born from weeks of crisis. Marcus was already at the control panel, his fingers dancing across the touchscreen with practiced urgency. Numbers cascaded down the display, each one telling a story he didn't want to read. The northern geothermal tap is failing. Temperature in sectors 7 through 12 is dropping fast. The weight of those words settled between them like a physical thing. Sectors 7 through 12 housed nearly 40% of their food production. The delicate tomatoes, the protein-rich beans, the leafy greens that kept scurvy at bay among their growing population of survivors. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. 6 hours, maybe 8 before we start losing plants. Marcus pulled up the facility schematics, the blue lines mapping out their underground world like arteries in a dying body. The backup heating system can maintain maybe half the affected area. We have to choose. Sarah's face went pale in the emergency lighting. Above them, 43 people slept in the expanded shelter areas they'd carved out over the past month. 43 souls who'd made it through the killing cold outside, who'd found their way to this sanctuary through word of mouth, desperation, and sheer luck. Each mouth to feed represented a careful calculation, a delicate balance between humanity and survival. "The protein crops," Sarah said finally. "If we lose those, people start dying within weeks." Marcus nodded grimly. "But if we save those and lose the vitamin sources, we're looking at malnutrition, disease, slower death, but death all the same." Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor as others began to wake. Tom Chen appeared first, the former city councilman who'd become their de facto leader for handling the human side of their underground society. His political instincts had proven invaluable in managing personalities and preventing the kind of conflicts that could tear their small community apart. "How bad?" Tom asked, reading their expressions with practiced ease. "Bad," Marcus replied. "We need to make a choice. And we need to make it now." More survivors gathered as word spread. Elena Rodriguez clutched her 8-year-old daughter close, the child's eyes wide with the kind of fear that children shouldn't have to know. James Wright, the former construction foreman whose expertise had helped them expand their living spaces, crossed his arms and waited for answers, with the patience of someone who'd seen enough disasters to know that panic solved nothing. "Explain it to us simply," Tom said. "What are our options?" Marcus gestured to the display, highlighting the affected sectors in pulsing red. "We can save the high-protein crops, beans, peas, the engineered soy. That keeps us from starving in the short term. Or we can save the nutrient-dense plants, leafy greens, tomatoes, the vitamin supplements we need to stay healthy long-term." "Can't we save both?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not enough backup power. The geothermal failure was catastrophic, probably a seismic shift in the underground thermal vents. I designed redundancies, but not for this level of system failure." The group fell silent, each person running their own calculations, weighing their own survival against the needs of the whole. It was the kind of impossible mathematics that the old world had never forced them to contemplate. "What about rationing?" James suggested. "Cut everyone's food allocation, stretch what we have." Sarah shook her head. "We're already at minimal nutritional levels. Any further reduction and we start losing people to weakness, making them susceptible to disease. I'm already treating cases of vitamin deficiency." "How long to repair the geothermal system?" Tom asked. "Weeks, maybe months," Marcus admitted. "I'd need to drill new access points, reroute the thermal collection system, and that's assuming the shift was localized and not part of a larger geological event." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the killing winter showed no signs of abating. The surface temperature hadn't risen above -40 in over a month. Even if the geothermal system could be repaired, they had to survive long enough to see it happen. "We vote," Tom said finally. "Everyone gets a say in what we prioritize." Marcus wanted to protest, to argue that this was a technical decision that required expertise, not democracy. But looking at the faces around him, parents, grandparents, children old enough to understand that their world balanced on the edge of a knife, he realized that Tom was right. If they were going to survive, they had to live with the consequences of their choices. All of them. The timer on his display showed 5 hours and 37 minutes remaining. The emergency beacon's shrill wail pierced through the underground facility's normally steady hum. Maya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the pattern. 3 short bursts, then silence, the surface detection alarm. She sprinted through the hydroponic corridors, her boots splashing through puddles of condensation that had been accumulating faster than the aging ventilation system could handle. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Chen's labored breathing as he struggled to keep pace. The old man's deteriorating condition had become impossible to ignore, but today there was no time for concern about his failing heart. "How many?" Chen gasped as they reached the main control room. Marcus was already hunched over the surveillance monitors, his face illuminated by the green glow of thermal imaging. "At least 40, maybe 50. They're organized, Maya. This isn't another desperate family. They have equipment." Maya studied the screens showing the frozen wasteland above. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the heat signatures arranged in a tactical formation around their concealed entrance. Several figures carried what appeared to be heavy machinery, drilling equipment, she realized with growing dread. "They found the thermal vents," she whispered. For months, they'd managed to keep the facility's heat signature minimal, but the increased crop production demanded more energy. Someone had finally connected the dots. "Dr. Reeves?" A voice crackled through the intercom. Sarah Chen, no relation to the older doctor, had taken over communications after Tommy's death 3 weeks ago. "You need to see this." Maya reluctantly activated the external audio pickup. The sound of generators and drilling filled the control room, but beneath it, she heard something worse. Voices. Organized, disciplined voices calling out coordinates and status reports. "They're military," Marcus said grimly. "Or ex-military. Look at their positioning. What's their approach vector?" Maya asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The main entrance, but they're also positioning teams at the emergency exits. They know our layout." The implications hit Maya like a physical blow. Someone had given them detailed information about the facility. She thought of the 17 people they'd turned away last month, the desperate faces pressed against the sealed entrance, as she'd made the impossible choice to protect those already inside. Chen collapsed into a chair, his face grey with exhaustion and something deeper, defeat. "How long before they breach?" Marcus checked the readings. "At their current rate, 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky." Maya's mind raced through their options. The facility's defensive measures were minimal, a few reinforced barriers and basic locks. She'd never imagined they'd face a coordinated assault. The underground complex had been designed to hide, not to withstand siege. "We could try to negotiate," Sarah's voice suggested through the intercom, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Negotiate what?" Marcus snapped. "They want in. We let them in, we all starve. It's basic mathematics." Maya stared at the monitors showing their thriving crops. Tomatoes, wheat, soybeans, all growing in careful abundance. The result of 7 months of impossible choices, of turning away the desperate while nurturing hope for humanity's future. The facility could sustain maybe 25 people indefinitely. They currently house 22. Adding 40% more would doom them all within weeks. "There is another option," Chen said quietly. His voice carried a weight that made everyone turn toward him. "The emergency protocol." Maya felt her stomach drop. The emergency protocol was theoretical, something Chen had designed but never tested. A complete system shutdown that would render the facility uninhabitable for weeks while preserving the genetic seed bank and core infrastructure. "You mean abandon everything?" Marcus asked. "The crops, the livestock, all of it?" "Better than letting it fall into the wrong hands," Chen replied. "We could relocate the essential personnel and genetic material to the backup site." Maya knew about the backup site, a much smaller facility 200 miles north, barely capable of sustaining 8 people. Choosing who would go meant condemning the rest to almost certain death in the frozen wasteland above. The drilling sounds grew louder, more urgent. Through the monitors, Maya watched the organized figures working with methodical efficiency. They had vehicles, supplies, enough equipment for an extended operation. This wasn't desperation, this was conquest. How long to implement the protocol? She asked. Chen's hands trembled as he pulled up the procedures on his tablet. 4 hours to properly preserve the genetic material. 2 more to evacuate essential personnel and supplies. That puts us right at their breach timeline, Marcus observed. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of another impossible decision. 22 lives under her protection, hundreds more genetic lines representing humanity's future, and now a hostile force that would destroy everything they'd built. The drilling stopped suddenly. In the silence that followed, Maya heard something that chilled her more than any winter wind. The sound of her own voice, distorted but unmistakable, broadcasting from speakers above. "We know you're down there, Dr. Reeves. We know about the food. It's time to share." The emergency klaxon pierced through the underground facility like a blade through silence. Sarah's hands froze over the hydroponics control panel as red warning lights bathed the growing chambers in an ominous crimson glow. She'd been monitoring the nutrient levels when the system detected something that made her blood run cold. "Marcus!" Her voice echoed through the corridors as she sprinted toward the main control room, her footsteps creating a staccato rhythm against the metal flooring. The displays showed catastrophic readings across multiple systems, but one in particular made her stomach lurch. The geothermal core temperature was dropping. Marcus burst through the doorway, his face already etched with the grim understanding that came from months of managing one crisis after another. Behind him, Dr. Chen and Pavel crowded into the space, their expressions shifting from concern to horror as they processed the scrolling data. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up diagnostic after diagnostic. "The primary geothermal tap is failing. We're losing heat faster than the backup systems can compensate. At this rate, we have maybe 72 hours before the growing chambers start freezing." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Without the crops, the 300 survivors sheltering in the facility would face starvation within weeks. The surface world remained locked in an endless winter, with temperatures that had claimed billions of lives already. Dr. Chen leaned over Sarah's shoulder, studying the thermal readings. "What about the secondary tap? We installed it as a redundancy." "It's not enough," Sarah replied, highlighting the projected curves on her screen. "Look at these consumption rates. We're supporting 3 times the population we originally planned for. Even with both systems running at full capacity, we're drawing more energy than we can sustainably generate." Pavel crossed his arms, his weathered face creased with thought. "So we reduce the population the facility supports." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Marcus felt something twist in his chest as he stared at his old friend. "You're talking about sending people back to the surface, to die." "I'm talking about mathematics," Pavel shot back. 300 people dying slowly versus 100 people living. "It's not a choice, Marcus. It's arithmetic." Through the glass partition separating the control room from the main corridor, Marcus could see families huddled around heating vents, children playing games with makeshift toys, elderly couples sharing rations while they tended to the mushroom cultivation areas. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were faces he recognized. Voices he'd heard pleading for sanctuary when they'd first arrived at his door. "There has to be another way," he said quietly. Dr. Chen pulled up geological surveys on another terminal. "What if we drill a new tap, go deeper, find a more stable heat source?" Sarah shook her head. "The drilling equipment is on the surface, buried under 40 feet of snow and ice. Even if we could reach it, the process would take weeks. We don't have that kind of time." The facility's backup generator kicked in with a low mechanical hum, reminding them all how precarious their situation had become. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought them to this moment. When he'd first conceived of this underground haven, it had been meant for his family and a small group of scientists. But as the climate disaster unfolded with unprecedented speed, turning away desperate survivors had become impossible. Now that compassion might doom them all. "Show me the consumption breakdown by sector," he said finally. Sarah complied, displaying energy usage across different areas of the facility. The residential quarters consumed 40% of their power, the growing chambers another 45%, with life support and other systems accounting for the remainder. We could reduce heating in the residential areas, Dr. Chen suggested. People can bundle up, share body heat. It's not comfortable, but it's survivable. For how long? Pavel asked. You're talking about extending our timeline by days, maybe a week. The fundamental problem remains. Marcus studied the faces of his companions, seeing his own desperation reflected in their eyes. Outside, the wind howled against the facility's surface structures, a constant reminder of the frozen wasteland that had consumed their world. The temperature readings showed minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an exposed human being in minutes. We start with conservation measures, he decided. Reduce heating, implement power rationing, see if we can buy enough time to find a real solution. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew they were inadequate. The mathematics were inexorable, just as Pavel had said. The facility's resources could only stretch so far before the choice became unavoidable: who deserved to live, and who would they condemn to die? The question haunted him as the warning klaxons continued their relentless wail. The emergency klaxon split the air like a scream, reverberating through the underground corridors with a metallic urgency that made Elena's blood freeze. She dropped the seedling tray she'd been carrying, ceramic shards scattering across the hydroponics bay floor as she ran toward the control room. Marcus was already there, his weathered hands flying across the environmental monitoring console, sweat beading on his forehead despite the controlled temperature. The screens around him blazed red with warning indicators. "What is it?" Elena gasped, skidding to a halt beside him. "Surface breach in Sector 7, Marcus said, his voice tight. "The thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures moving down through the ventilation shaft. They found us." Elena's stomach dropped. After months of careful concealment, of maintaining radio silence and masking their heat signatures, someone had finally tracked them down. Through the security feed, she could see figures rappelling down the emergency exit shaft, dark silhouettes against the pale concrete walls. "How many?" she asked. 12, maybe 15. Armed. Marcus's fingers danced across the keyboard, engaging the facility's lockdown protocols. "They'll reach the main level in 10 minutes. The gravity of their situation crashed over Elena like a wave. The underground farm housed 43 people now, families they'd taken in over the past weeks as reports filtered down about the surface world's continued collapse. Children who'd been born in the facility had never seen sunlight. Adults who'd lost everything above ground except their lives. "We can't let them in," Elena said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "If they're desperate enough to break in here, they won't stop at taking just food. They'll want everything." Marcus's jaw tightened. "The emergency lockdown will seal all the access points." "But Elena," he turned to face her, and she saw the terrible weight of understanding in his eyes. "If we lock it down now, with them in the shaft, they'll be trapped," Elena finished. "They'll suffocate or freeze." The klaxon continued its relentless wail, punctuated now by the sound of running feet in the corridors beyond. Dr. Sarah Chen burst into the control room, her medical coat stained with soil from the grow labs. "What's happening?" "The children are terrified. Intruders," Marcus said simply. "We need to decide. Now." Through the security feed, Elena could see the lead figure had reached the first checkpoint door. They were working on the lock with some kind of cutting tool, sparks showering down into the darkness below them. In the background, she could make out what looked like automatic weapons strapped to their backs. "They're not here to negotiate," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at them. They're organized, military-trained. If they get in—" She thought of little Tommy, who'd been born 3 weeks ago in the medical bay, of Maria and her twin daughters, who still woke screaming from nightmares about the frozen wasteland they'd escaped. Of the elderly couple, the Hendersons, who'd arrived last month with severe frostbite and were only now starting to recover. The cutting tool broke through the first lock. 8 minutes, Marcus said. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 43 lives pressing down on her shoulders. Above ground, the world had become a frozen hellscape where desperate people did unthinkable things to survive. Down here, they'd built something precious, a small pocket of warmth and life in the endless winter, a future. There has to be another way, Dr. Chen said desperately. Can't we negotiate, offer them food in exchange for leaving us alone? Look at their equipment, Marcus said, gesturing to the screen. These aren't starving refugees. This is a coordinated assault. They know what we have down here, and they want all of it. Elena opened her eyes and stared at the red lockdown button on the console. Such a small thing to hold so much power. Press it, and 15 people would die slowly in the dark above them. Don't press it, and 43 people, including children, would face whatever these armed intruders had planned. The Hendersons made it through 3 weeks above ground after their shelter failed, she said quietly. Maria carried her daughters for 60 miles through blizzards. Tommy was born in the middle of the worst storm we'd recorded. Every person down here fought to survive, fought to make it to safety. The second lock gave way with a shower of sparks. 6 minutes, Marcus announced. Elena's hand hovered over the lockdown button. In the distance, she could hear children crying, their voices echoing through the corridors like ghosts. The sound crystallized her resolve. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and pressed the button. The lights dimmed as blast doors slammed shut throughout the facility. Emergency seals hissed into place. The ventilation system automatically switched to internal recycling mode, cutting off all air exchange with the surface. On the security monitor, the figures in the shaft began pounding frantically on the sealed doors above them, their voices distant and desperate through the speakers. Elena turned away from the screen, but she knew she'd never forget the sound. The emergency lights cast everything in amber as Maya's fingers flew across the control panel. The hydroponics bay hummed with renewed life, but she could feel the tremor in the walls. The ice above them was shifting, groaning under its own impossible weight. Through the reinforced glass, she watched Dr. Chen and his team harvesting the last of the potato crop with methodical precision. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the increasingly cold air. Maya checked the thermal readings, maybe 6 hours before the main heating grid fails completely. The backup geothermal should hold, but she didn't finish. They all knew the backup wouldn't support the entire facility. Marcus limped into the control room, his makeshift crutch scraping against the metal floor. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with the same intensity that had driven him to build this sanctuary. "The eastern tunnels are already compromised. We need to evacuate everyone to the core sections." "That's barely enough space for half the people down here," Sarah said. "I know." The weight of those 2 words crushed the air from the room. Maya's console chirped with an incoming transmission. Static filled the speakers before a voice broke through, weak, distant, but unmistakably human. "This is Dr. Elena Vasquez, Antarctic Research Station Omega. Is anyone out there? We've detected thermal signatures from your location. We have 43 survivors and a functional transport. Can you respond?" The 3 of them stared at each other. After months of silence, another pocket of humanity had found them. Marcus reached for the transmitter, then hesitated. "If we respond," he said quietly, "we're committing to saving them. That's 43 more people competing for resources we don't have. And if we don't respond, they die out there," Maya said, "just like everyone else we've turned away." The moral calculus that had tormented Marcus for months crystallized in this moment. Every decision had led to this, the final choice between salvation and survival. Through the observation window, he could see families huddled together, children who had learned to play quietly in the twilight of civilization. These people trusted him with their lives. Sarah took the transmitter from his trembling hand. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Underground Sanctuary 7. We read you. What's your position?" As she coordinated the rescue, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The burden of playing God, of choosing who lived and died, had nearly destroyed him. But perhaps there was another way. "Chen," he called into his communicator. "I need you in the machine shop. Bring your engineering team." An hour later, they had stripped every non-essential system in the facility. The recreation areas went dark, the auxiliary growing chambers shut down, even the laboratory equipment was cannibalized for parts. Maya rerouted power through jury-rigged connections, while Chen's team modified the air recycling systems to handle maximum capacity. "It won't be comfortable," Marcus warned the assembled survivors as the first refugees from Station Omega stumbled through the main airlock, frost coating their survival suits. "We're going to be crowded, rationed, cold, but we're going to be alive." Dr. Vasquez was a small woman with fierce eyes and frostbitten hands. She gripped Marcus's arm as her people filed past. "There are others," she said. "We picked up radio chatter from at least 3 more groups scattered across the continent." Marcus nodded, understanding. The choice wasn't between salvation and survival anymore. It was between isolation and hope. "We'll find a way to bring them home too." As the facility groaned under the weight of ice and humanity, Maya monitored the critical systems. The numbers were impossible on paper, but somehow they held. Dr. Chen organized the newcomers into work rotations. Sarah distributed the remaining food stores with mathematical precision. And in the depths of the underground sanctuary, children from 2 different worlds of survivors played together while the surface froze solid above them. The transmission array crackled to life with new voices. Survivors from a military bunker in Colorado, a research team trapped in Alaska, a family that had somehow endured in a reinforced basement in Minnesota. Each signal was a lifeline thrown across the frozen wasteland. Marcus stood in the observation deck, watching the controlled chaos of humanity adapting, surviving, thriving even in impossible circumstances. The readings showed they had enough food for maybe 2 months at current population. The heating grid was running at 110% capacity. The water recyclers were past their design limits. It should have been terrifying. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: optimism. Maya joined him at the window. The surface temperature readings are finally stabilizing, still deadly, but not dropping anymore. And the global atmospheric data? Early signs of recovery. Very early, but it's there. Below them, Dr. Vasquez was sharing stories from the outside world with a group of children who had never seen sunlight. The stories spoke of resilience, of pockets of survivors scattered across the globe, of humanity's stubborn refusal to simply disappear. Marcus smiled for the first time since the winter began. They would survive this, all of them.